Thank you for joining in for our second week in our webinar series. On behalf of my colleague, Nina Patel from Video Conferencing for Global Learning, it's a joy to welcome you here. My name is Renee Carver, and I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Claudette Crawford-Brown, Dr. Khadijah Williams, and Mr. Sidney Henry to try to pull this series of talks together for you. We're excited that they're here with us. Dr. Henry this morning will present on food security and its interconnectedness to globalization and international relations.
I'm not hearing you, Renee.
Migration. Specifically, he'll discuss how the movement of people and the public policy which informs this impacts on food security in a globalized world. And Dr. Esnard will examine the structural inequalities and mobilities of seasonal farm workers from the Caribbean. Her work offers some insights into the structural vulnerabilities and systemic challenges of the minority groups such as women and mothers in this program. It also looks at issues of precarity and calls for regional collaboration and policies that address the systemic issues affecting the social mobilities of these workers. To start us off this morning, we're lucky to have Dr. Claudette Crawford-Brown back with us to share with us a few minutes of introduction. Dr. Crawford-Brown, go ahead. All right, having lost Dr. Crawford-Brown's video feed, Mr. Henry, I think it best if we put you on the spot and ask you to continue for us.
And good morning, everyone, and greetings to everyone, wherever you are in the world. I'm happy to be a part of this opportunity to share in this conversation. I will discuss with us a little this morning the issues around food security and its interconnectedness to globalization and international relations, especially with regard to migration, how the movement of people and the related public policies that inform this impacts food security in a globalized world. I think I'd start out with the idea that the construction of meaning in the discourse that posits globalization as a subject is to be found on a continuum of dynamic interpretations. The concept spans the social and economic and sometimes spiritual and political spectrum of the human experience in a kaleidoscope of human relationships. What is this inevitable process of interconnected experiences in which we are all powerless players groping for meaning? I would say this seemingly predetermined natural path towards outcomes that is often devoid of justice and equity and fair play. Too often it seems the experience seems to abandon or disenfranchise and deny large swaths of humanity while creating some kind of unfettered access and ops. The underbelly, I think, of this phenomena includes the manipulation and the application of what are new and emerging ICTs, borderless economies, merging cultures with a clear shift in what was previously understood of the order of the world or the world order. So it seems then, food security within this construct is more than the determination of nutritional balance in adequate food that is available and affordable in sustainable ways. It is a pivot in outcomes in the sustainable development goals that give definition and determination to the quality of life of the Earth's population. Among these international goals, if you will, Sustainable Development Goal 1, number 2, number 3, capturing milestones that include poverty, hunger, and health. The definition of food security must include then, in a wider context, what are these social, economic, environmental, and political imperatives that give scope to our understanding of its meaning. Within these parameters are those terminologies which include climate change, and in this regard, energy production and use, population, the growth, movement, quality of life of people, global markets, that's the production and trade, commodity pricing, healthcare, pharma, insurance, disease, pandemics, for sure. So then, to the extent that these are variables that support our interpretation and our understanding of the concept of food security, there are local and international policy frameworks that support the relationships between all of these. So the movement of people in today's migrant world, I would say, is both a virtual and an existential reality. Populations exist and coexist in an ecosystem that has implications for both the national, implications for the built environment and the natural environment. Migration and the free movement of people within and across borders has implications for populations generally in the fundamental areas of poverty and the experience of poverty, of hunger, its experience, and of health. So to the extent that these are also indicators of wealth, nutrition, nutritional value, and quality of life, the need for equity, fair play, social justice, the need for these things, to the extent that these are indicators of these things, it has made it necessary for international agreements to be developed, local policies to guide state actors and people in general with regard to these issues. So we would see political manifestos often including positions regarding migration and the people groups that are involved. These are sensitive issues because of implications for the interconnectedness of the variables that were previously described. In the United States, for instance, the candidates for president are often also associated with sometimes extreme polar positions regarding migrants. Quite often at the southern border, where poverty, health, and health-related and health resulting in food insecurity in South American countries have caused people to flee these jurisdictions. So public policy has had to be developed, enacted to defend, and sometimes to determine citizenship and the position of migrants and what this has for implications for food security. Migrants enter the workforce, they influence the minimum wage and the indicators of poverty, of hunger, of proper health care for the population. Food security to include production, storage, and distribution, and its attendant challenges for the cost of production, user affordability, commodity trading, and international relations regarding food has implications for seeds, for fertilizers, the use of water, its availability, collection and storage. So these in turn have implications for the experience of migration, both within and across borders, of not only for the poor and usually disenfranchised populations, but also for the middle class who desire to have a quality of life that is commensurate with their academic pursuits and their ambitions. So the region, for example, has had intra and extra-regional migration patterns. And these have had social and political influences with outcomes that have supported integration as well as economic development affecting food security. Migration beyond the region of the people of the region have had both push and pull factors. And these have included and are also influenced food security in receiving countries for migrants, as well as for countries from which these migrants have come. And so developed North American countries, including Canada, the US, have had migrants to supply labor to seasonal farms. These returning migrants have been able to improve the character of their experience of food security with improvements in with regard to the experience of poverty, health, hunger, and the index around that, while having contributed to the stability of the value chain in other jurisdictions as well as back at home. Now, I think Jamaica, as the largest English-speaking country, has also had another level of migrant from its shores, and described most often as a brain drain of highly skilled workers, most times with an income bracket that does not support the sustainable support of poverty, hunger, compromised health, and all of these which are directly related to food security. But we continue to experience the migration of these persons, and we continue to refer to it often as a brain drain, but it has implications for other levels of experience with regard to those variables that help us to understand food security. So these workers leave, and with that, they intend to be able to change or to transform the experience that they have had personally, but also of those who they have left behind. And they also contribute to the changing of the nature of food security in the countries to which they have migrated. Migration and its relationship to food security cannot be adequately discussed, I think, without an examination of the migrant population who now have citizenship in the receiving country, the diaspora, that contributes to the local economy, in as much as they perpetuate the local culture through their consumption of local products, of culture, and their desire for those inputs as exports, as well as through their remittances to family back at home. These remittances support outcomes in those variables that help us to better understand food security. They transform the reality of those who are back home, particularly when these remittances become a significant contribution to what is the GDP of the receiving country. And so food security in its construction, where it reflects poverty levels or changing poverty levels, different types of experience of hunger or healthcare or quality of life, these migrants have added value because of how it is that they interact in the host country and respond to those who are, if for want of a better term, left behind. Ultimately then, I would close by saying, we must ask then what new policy perspectives should be or can be or ought to be developed to protect the indigenous construction of food security as that construction evolves within the context of changing global relations and relationships, and even in the experience of a pandemic. What are the new perspectives that need to be challenged of how we used to see policy developed to support sustainability with regard to these inputs that define the character of what is food security? Secondly, how can migration that is impacted upon by a pandemic and within a pandemic, how can that experience, whether virtually or in reality, existentially, how can migration that is impacted by this pandemic that we are experiencing be engineered, I think, with new policy protocols to protect participating populations of migrants, because they will continue to go after the new norm, if we will, after we have determined and defined how it is that for the need for migration will still exist, and actually will have emergent new ways in which the experience can happen and is going to happen. And we then have to look to see how we protect the population and the population from which they have come as migrants to support sustainable ways in which food security can be enhanced. And then what are those local and international security risks that are faced and must be contended with in the population from which migration would have occurred, and certainly in the population to which those migrants would have gone? What are those risks to the experience of food security and its attendant characteristics that help us to better understand if we want to have sustainability with regard to those development goals that people must experience, that define the characteristic of poverty, that define healthcare, that define quality nutrition among the population. What are those risks and how do we prepare to engage with a population who are migrants and those who must treat with the development of the public policy and the space in which that happens to create
wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. There's an awful lot to unpack there, and I
so
really
these are my
look forward to
thoughts
the
that I
students
would have shared,
engaging
and
with
I
you
would
with their
then
questions
entertain
later.
when the
And I
time
think
comes
what we'll
those
do now
questions
is
or
we will
concerns or
pass it over
comments
to Dr.
that have to
Esnard
be made.
for her presentation. And once Dr. Esnard is finished, I'm happy to report that Dr. Khadija Williams will moderate the question and answer with the students. So Dr. Esnard, we are on to you, please.
So good morning and welcome everyone who's sharing this virtual space with us this morning. This is really wonderful to be here with you. And I look at the eager faces and I see a future, very bright one indeed. And certainly a forum like this reminds us of the work that we have to do as educators, not just to speak the content that we deliver in the ordinary classroom, but to reach out to young minds like yourself and to create a footprint, a memory, hopefully in the future that would take you where you will be. And hopefully this particular forum will be certainly inspiring to one, or if not all of you at the end of the day. I sat here this morning listening to the presentation and I thought how wonderful, because the presentation just before this set a context, a pre-context, I think it was, of the whole issue of migration and what it means for us as a region, and certainly issues of remittances and the well-being of workers and migrants themselves. I this morning would like to go a bit deeper and probably as an extension of the presentation this morning to look particularly at migrant workers coming from the Caribbean and going to Canada on what is now dubbed as the SWAP program, which is really the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. Most of you may be quite familiar that we have a history of migration from the region, and you would know at this point of some of the key parts of the globe that our people migrate to, and they're part of the societies and contribute in very meaningful ways. I want to particularly invite you this morning to look at the seasonal migrant workers who travel to Canada to contribute to the farms in Canada, who are part of an agreement between the Canadian government and Caribbean governments, and who are really in probably more ways than we know of and are recorded, contributing to food sustainability and food security across the globe. And it's not just for Canada, but really it's across the globe, given that Canada is one of the largest exporters of agricultural produce. So I want to move, given the time that we have, to just a brief on what exactly is the SWAP program, and just to give you a sense of what are we dealing with in terms of how this program was constructed, and particularly how our Caribbean workers are involved in this particular process. And to take you into just a very short history, and to share that this particular program was really established in 1966. And what we had at the time was a high demand for agricultural workers in Canada, and a situation internally where the Canadian government and the farm workers expressed a lack of confidence in the ability of local persons and that local labor force to fulfill the mandate of the farms and the demand that they had at that particular point in time. The agreement really was on using agricultural workers from the Caribbean to sort of bridge that gap and to fill in that void that was now present in the Canadian space, and to provide that necessary labor to sustain the farms and to really bring it to the point that was necessary for export of those produce. And what was established very early was that the workers from the region would go seasonally, meaning that for a particular period of the year to Canada, and then return at the end of those 8 months back to the Caribbean. And therefore, it was never planned and conceived of as an arrangement that they would go to migrate permanently, but really just to temporarily assist with the issue of labor, particularly on the farms. And we had, for example, Jamaica starting extended to Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and certainly to many OACS countries. The agreement also allows for the government in the regions and really that bilateral agreement between Canada and the Caribbean governments to take care of issues of accommodation, travel, the wage, and the establishment of the contracts for those workers. So essentially, it's not an individual program. It's not individualized in a way that workers decide to go to Canada and they migrate for a period of 6 to 8 months and come back. It's really an institutionalized program, really supported by various governments in the region and certainly the Canadian government. It's important, though, that in looking at this issue, to understand that the seasonal workers, and this is what they call seasonal agricultural workers, are really contributing to not just a labor shortage issue in Canada as it was perceived or as it was marketed or sold to regional governments, but to really solve the issue of food security and food sustainability, not just for Canada and not just for their economy, but also globally as well. This is really about a global supply chain where we recognize the value of food, what it means for us as people and our own sustainability. And it is really moving around that circle of planting and really harvesting what they have planted on those farms and using that process as a way to really sustain that global supply chain and contribute to the issue of food security, as I said, and food mobility. Having said that, and recognizing the value that those workers add to those key issues, I think it's therefore important not just to take that for what it's worth, but to then understand and situate how then are the workers positioned in this particular cycle. So we understand what they do, we understand the value and the contributions that they make, but how often do you hear of the challenges and the experiences and some of the issues that the workers have in that cycle and in the contributions that they make? And I think it's really important not just to situate that, but to understand that particular narrative and to do something about it at the end of the day. So that this diagram, really, before we move into those challenges, just gets you to appreciate how the program has mushroomed over the years, from 1966 with just a few workers to by 2000 and into the current period, over 10, 12, 20,000 workers. So that this is not a small program. This is a program that employs significant amount of farm workers from the region. And of course, it has mushroomed to the extent that it's no longer Caribbean workers. There are also Mexican workers, so that the entire program has expanded to include different workers across different contexts and regions and parts of the globe. And I want to take your attention to the pros and the cons of this particular program. Certainly, I think without a doubt, we understand the economic value of this particular arrangement. We understand what it means for the Canadian economy. We understand what it means for the workers themselves. And in most cases, those workers are coming from countries like Barbados and Jamaica, where in their own local space, they are either in employment situations that they would like to bolster, or they are out of employment and they would like to seek employment to maintain and to sustain their own families. So without a doubt, the program benefits both the workers and definitely the farmers, the state, federal government, and all of the lot. And certainly they are creating an effective labor system that allows for that essential service in the Canadian food chain. I remember most recently having a conversation with one of the farm workers who reminded the panel and the audience that they are doing work that typical Canadians who are at their very level do not want to do, or are not committing themselves or volunteering, not volunteering, but certainly putting themselves in the position to serve in that capacity. They also recognize that they are allowing that cycle to continue. So that, yes, they are on the farm, they are also producing food, they're also sustaining our people, they're sustaining themselves, but remember that they're also sustaining their families and the future of their families. So that when those workers come and they migrate to the Canadian context, yes, they are getting incomes for themselves, but more often than not, those workers are using the incomes and they're giving back to their families, their loved ones, and they're holding them. And in some cases, the data would show that it's not just holding them, they are helping their futures. They are paying for schools, they're paying for homes, for them to eat. Their basic needs are being met through their engagement in a program such as this. So let's understand the value first of this particular program. In fact, the program the value of this is recognized in such a way that it has been dubbed as one of the best practices in terms of managed migration, because it allows for a process that is not just managed for it to produce a particular outcome, but it is supported by the state, by the Farmers Association, by the trade unions, and therefore that sort of institutionalization gives it a sense of sort of direction that they could sort of weave and maneuver over the course of the program. But understand, in as much as this is a best practice or dubbed in this particular way, even when we have best practices, there might be loopholes. There might be aspects of a particular practice that needs refinement or perhaps review and revamping completely. And what this program has really brought certainly a lot of attention to the economic vulnerability of those workers. So while we understand what it does for them economically, socially, politically, in terms of their own mobility and advancement, it's also important that we recognize that those workers are in an economically vulnerable situation. The question is why? Because they are chosen, and this is part of what's coming out of the literature, from a context of vulnerability. When the workers are being selected, there is a suspicion, there are questions on whether they are employing the most vulnerable person in terms of someone who is unemployed, someone without, so for example, university level education, or without particular assets that they could use to also bolster their family. The element of vulnerability and the selection process, there is certainly questions, or there are questions over whether the selection of workers are so designed that they are really looking at persons who are already vulnerable. They're already in a position where they are willing to accept anything that they're given. Because once you are in that position, it's very easy to sway not only your decision, but your action and your commitment and your devotion to someone who's giving. You tend not to question because your giver becomes your lifesaver, right? So those issues are very important for us to understand. But certainly, I think even more important for us to question is, whose interest does this serve more than the other? And certainly the narrative points us to the technocrats and the capitalists and the farmers, not necessarily the workers and their families. So who are we targeting? Who are we directing the benefits of this program towards? And is there or can there be a balance? Can there be a balance between the benefits that accrue to the workers as well as the farmers or even the governments? Is it even possible? Is it even, in a good place for us to ask those questions? But certainly, I think it's important, while those questions might be uncomfortable ones, and certainly drive another level of criticism and scrutiny of the program, we need to understand the whole issue of who fits the bill. to be selected as a seasonal worker. And if you look at the literature and you just scan through what exists right now, what you will see is reference to some of the following. They're looking for hard workers, obedient, flexible, adaptive, easily replaceable, easily movable, right? Flexible, low skilled, that you could react as you are required to. You could move in the moment that you are asked, and you are sort of described as quick fix workers. So when you are constructed with that narrative of who best fits the bill to move as farm workers, that creates a problem, not just for how you are received in the selection, but for also how you are treated when you get onto those farms. Okay, and we have to understand that. So when we look at the next slide, I want you to understand that even in that selection, there's an idealization of the typical workers that fit that bill. So we're looking at how the constructions of those workers then become crystallized in particular agendas that subordinate those workers, that make them feel inferior, less valued, and their worth not really taken for what it is on those farms. The issue of race comes into play. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of writing of the racialized narratives, meaning that they are looking for, and they are working with that storyline and that narrative that you are looking for persons in particular regions of the globe, maybe third world countries, quote unquote, and I take to issue the use of that word, but I'm using it in the context for which it is used, for you to also understand that when I say that I'm taking workers from the third world, it means that they're coming from a position of poverty anyway. So we're helping them, right? Those are racialized conversations. And I want you to understand, rather than using the word third world, why not the global south? Why not Latin America, Caribbean, or African countries as they are named and they identify with? So that narrative and that racialization of that narrative is really something that we have to question as scholars, as people of the region. Then there's the issue of nationality. There are the stereotypes that exist, that certain parts of the globe you find people who will work for anything, right? Those are also racialized narratives. Those are class narratives. Those are certain constructions about who we are as people that are used to the benefit of persons who are profit-oriented and minded, without the well-being of the persons that are being employed in their hearts, and as part of the thinking through of why we are employing those workers, all right? So the issue of compliance is subsumed within the racial construction of those workers. If we employ persons who are already vulnerable, who are already from low-class background, who don't have much of an education, who come from the third world, quote unquote, they should be compliant. They should be good workers, just as the slaves were. Let's unpack that and understand that those narratives reproduce certain constructions that do not aid and support the well-being of workers when on the farms. But what about our women? Very interesting, you would note, if you also read and delve into this, that most of the workers are men. In fact, 95% of workers across the lifespan of this program have been men. And we're talking about since 1966. But even when these women are employed on those farms, there is the gender division of work, so that they are given certain tasks that are deemed suitable for women, right? They are placed in a way where they are separated in the dorms. They are treated differently. They are even more vulnerable because we have concerns for the reproductive health, the sexual health, based on the exposure to the chemicals on those farms. And then we have concerns about their own well-being. Remember that they are leaving those countries, in most cases, as parents of single households, head of households. They are vulnerable in ways that they are providing for their children. I personally interviewed one young lady from Jamaica, for example, and her story has stayed with me, and it will continue to stay with me, who used this program to feed 3 daughters, to carry 2 of them to school, both of which completed their masters at the University of the West Indies. The older one went with her to allow the other 2 to complete their education. But this lady, her program is also one that gives you, it makes you recognize what she's going through. She struggles and struggled every day, remembering that her kids, the younger ones, are left behind. She looks forward to meeting them. She recognizes the struggles that she's making, but she also pains that her children are home on an everyday basis, not having her love and her support as a mother there with them. So the issue of the mothers and the women, it remains invisible in the conversation, but it's just as important as any other part of that conversation, right? And we also have to recognize that. Sorry. I want you to also note that the situation of those workers are even more worrisome once you also are aware that there's a system of surveillance that controls and manages those workers. There are curfews, there are limited movements and visitation for those workers. And let's put it this way, they are on the farms, they arrive on the farms, they cannot go and they are restricted to leave the farms outside of certain hours. They cannot interact with the visitors that do not log into the farm and do not have that freedom of mobility or flexibility of movement as we would have to say, right now, I'm going to leave work maybe in the next hour and I'm going to go to the supermarket to pick up something and then come back into the office. That freedom is not what's in the hands of those workers. But that freedom of movement is just as important for issues of our mental health, right? The well-being of workers. And what's even more worrisome is that understanding that they've been looked at, monitored, and surveyed is not just affecting negatively their mental health, but it's making them constantly look behind to ensure that they're not being watched. And there's that fear of reprisal that is developing from that process. So if I do this, perhaps I'm going to get in trouble. I think I want to stay on the farm because if I leave, it's not going to put me in the good books that I need to be to get employed by this farmer next year. So that element of paternalism, he helped you and therefore you owe him for the job, you owe him for the opportunity, and therefore you need not do anything that would go against the farmer who has employed you and given you this opportunity to help your family and help yourself. So that thinking, that situation is a damning one because it puts you in a position where you feel that you cannot go against someone who has done so much for you. Even when you're in a position where your own freedom is being curtailed, your mental health and your well-being is certainly in question. And let's not forget that those workers are entering into white spaces, racialized spaces. They are not coming in at the same level of power as those persons who are in the communities. So there's what they call microaggression. There's subtle racism. There's this element that you are not of us, and therefore you cannot be among us. And those workers tell of the stories of going into little stores and supermarkets and being profiled, being called names, and being segregated when they visit public spaces because of the racialized conversations and treatments against those workers. So those are some of the things I think that we also need to understand, and then to move to the position and the understanding of how this makes the workers powerless in a sense that they can't respond. They have no one to speak on their behalf outside of the advocates and persons who are pushing for their situations to be heard and addressed. But they are also temporarily permanent. Just imagine that concept. It's an oxymoron, right? Does that make sense to you? How could someone be temporary and permanent at the same time? Yes, because you are there for 8 months. You are fixed in that space, but at the end of the 8 months, you have to go back. There's no aspect of this design and this structure that allows for those workers to say, well, I have served in this program for the last 10 years, 8 months for the last 10 years. I would like to stay. And I would like to bring my family to Canada. That option does not exist. And therefore, they will remain temporarily permanent. They are critical or essential workers, but they're just as disposable. So at the end of 8 months, that's it. You could be working for that same farmer for 10 years, and the farmer could choose to dismiss you after 10 years. And that becomes your fate. If you're injured, you're sent back home. And there are groups of workers who are now working to address that injustice for workers who've been serving for years, got an injury, and have to return home without the benefits that accrued to them over the process of those years, right? So we have those workers are repatriated because they're non-compliant, they refuse to work, they're injured, or they're just so crippled with fear of being perceived in a way that does not benefit them as workers, that they keep the silence. And that's when it becomes not just worrisome, but certainly I would think a health issue. It certainly is a well-being concern that we cannot take very lightly. But what about COVID? So we have those workers essential. They have to go on their farms. They have to travel coming out of the region to go to Canada in the midst of a pandemic. What happens then? Do our concerns escalate for those workers? Of course they will, because those workers are literally entering into a space where they're not just vulnerable, but they're at risk of dying. So that the concerns coming out of those migrant workers are now shifting more critically, even so, to the issue of what happens to those workers if they contract COVID? What happens on the farms when they are interacting, and are they protected while they are on the farms? Are they given the necessary gears? What about insurance for those workers? How are they protected, not just physically, but socially and financially, if they are being recruited in those programs? So we had those issues and concerns, particularly of the, for example, Jamaican government. These were part of the headlines. The Jamaican government, asked that these workers who were leaving Jamaica sign a waiver that removes the government from any liability if those workers contracted COVID. So just imagine the risk and the level of risk and how that escalates into a whole different level and puts that worker in an even more vulnerable situation. And the government continued, the waivers were signed, those workers went up to the farms, and not too long after, there were multiple outbreaks across Canada. We have a picture here of the outbreak in Vermont, for example, and many other outbreaks that subsequently followed after arrival on those farms. What I would like you to remember is this, and all copyrights go to the designer. You can't pick strawberries working remotely. We have shifted to do a lot of what we typically do on an everyday basis remotely. But the one thing that we can do is, at this point, for this particular program, because I know technology might take us to a whole different space soon, but we can't pick the strawberries remotely at this point. Keep that in mind. So what happens to those workers? We are safe and we are working behind the screen remotely. I'm talking to you remotely. My safety becomes the priority here in terms of the virtual space. What about those agricultural workers? What about their families? I want for us to remember that. And to end, because I know we are in a time right now, I want for us to note that in as much as this program benefits the workers, their families, the farmers and the Canadian government, and even ours to an extent, and it helps the issue of employment across the region, it's important that we redesign, review, revamp, rebuild the program in such a way that it sustains not just the farmers, the workers, but they're also the families in ways that allow them to grow and to become and to be all right? And we must remember, as part of this process, it's about working with those farmers. It's about sensitization. It's about building those communities. It's about advocacy. But it's also about monitoring and evaluation of those programs. It's about accountability and transparency. It's about holding persons accountable for what they have been charged with. But I want to end by also saying, when we build economies, economies are not built on machines only, they're also built on people. So that when we are talking about the economy of farm work, let's also remember about the whole issue of the moral economy and keep the hearts, the well-being, and the families of those workers also as part of the conversation about how do we advance and manage these sort of migration models and programs that have been with us in this case since 1966. I thank you.
Actually, I am passing it to Dr. Khadija Williams to take it on from here.
Thank you, Mr. Carver, and good morning again to everyone, and really good to see you all there. I want to get straight into the students' involvement, and I know Dr. Brown is there too, waiting to engage you and to help bring some of the links from last week to this week from Mr. Henry and Dr. Esnard. If you hear a lot of animals in my background, it's because I'm on a farm in Jamaica, just to bring it real to you, right? And we have heavy winds, so if my banner falls, don't laugh at me. So students, let's get involved. We would like to hear from you so far. For example, what Mr. Henry talked about in terms of globalization and the role of public policies and how it's impacting migrants. We want to hear from you in terms how does this link with what you already know? Yeah, and then from Dr. Esnard, we would want to hear from you if you know you have any practical situations, know of any farm workers who went overseas, what are the experiences? We want you to get engaged. Ask any questions, make comments. Dr. Brown is here as well, so she will also engage with us. Yeah, so this is your time to talk, for us to hear from you how you've been receiving the information. And teachers, feel free to prompt them. We really need to hear from the young people.
I wonder if I could just jumpstart the situation by just making a comment, Dr. Williams.
Go ahead, Dr. Brown, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to remind as students think about their questions, students that Dr. Esnard and Mr. Henry's presentation dovetails into some of the issues that we discussed last week, because they are really the push factors. We spoke last week about what's happening at the family level, at the micro level, and here we have Dr. Esnard and Mr. Williams talking about what our parents are doing. What are those parents getting into? What are the social, psychological, and cultural issues that they have to face when they go? So as they pose their questions, I remember Andrea Waldron last week raising some concerns about those parents who picked up themselves and they went to foreign. Here we are today talking about, from Dr. Esnard, what they did. Can some of you comment on some of those issues? Because I want you as Caribbean people to understand your responsibilities and your,
yes.
your concerns going forward as to how we tie all of these different pieces together.
And I would like to prompt Donovan, because Donovan sent me a beautiful message. So I want him to explain and say what he messaged me during the presentation. So I want him to say it. So come on, Donovan.
Donovan, go on.
Yes, good morning. I told Miss that thing that Dr. Esnard was saying kind of sounds like modern day racism to me. I mean, modern day slavery to me.
Right. Yeah. Quite interesting, Donovan.
Continue, Donovan, because it wasn't one message you sent me. That Donovan is shy. Donovan was, well, yeah, when we spoke about the workers in Canada and so forth, Donovan expressed interest in going because he was like, yes, miss, this sounding good. But when he heard the presentation, the first thing he messaged was, Miss, I have changed my mind. So, and then he continued. So, yes, so the presentation, actually it gave him a first hand of what exactly to expect. Because sometimes because I know of students who went, but Dr. Esnad, one of the things that they promote is in terms of, well, you could go for a 8 month. That's not a long time. You can come back and still have your life. So, that is when you go to the Ministry of Labor, they kind of push those things on vulnerable persons who see it as, yes, I can go make a quick dollar because I know that they don't give them the whole fund. So they keep back some so that when they do return, they're returning with a lump sum. So, these are things that, yes, they're seen as something good because they could save and get a quick fix in 8 months.
Quite interesting there, and thanks also for summarizing his thoughts, yeah, Mrs. Moraldo Bowen. So we're hearing the term modern day slavery and the presentation by Dr. Esnad being that comparison with it. Quite interesting. Do we have any other persons in the group here today who would like to share another perspective on what was presented?
If I may.
Go ahead, Ms. Bihari.
Thank you. There we go. To bring things in perspective for my students, particularly my Form 5 students, hi guys. For example, one of the things we learned about is the way government policies. So guys, government policies, remember we talked about initiatives in Barbados, we talked about initiatives in Jamaica, we talked about the new agricultural development plan. Trinidad has the Agricultural Development Bank, and all of the initiatives the governments are trying to enable farmers. The persons that they are talking about do not have the initial startup capital, the initial money to really get going. They're the ones, the farmers who these policies are targeting are farmers who have existing property that they have been farming and are falling on hard times, or do not have the capital, the money to invest in their farms. So the government policies in that case help them. The persons we're talking about are the persons those farmers would hire. But remember, farms do not see immediate profit. Remember, that's one thing we talked about, that farming is a long-term investment, even if you do cash crops. So in this instance, they're looking at employees in this instance. Yes, perhaps modern day slaves. I'm happy Donovan came up with that because that was initially the thought I had as well. Yes, they're thinking about modern day slaves, and yes, but they are still considered employees. Because they're considered employees, they get a monthly stipend and a lump sum to come home with that they can then give to their family members. They become primary breadwinners. That isn't where their labor isn't tied to the product, but tied to their labor. So in this instance, we're looking at a totally different way of looking at agriculture, where you're mechanizing human effort in an instance where it's no longer the product that you're producing, but the sweat, the blood, the tears that you put into the product. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ms. Bihari. I would want to ask also if you have any questions directed at Mr. Henry or Dr. Esnad. Now is a great time, as I know we're coming to the close. As you know, Dr. Esnad is based there up at UWI, heading the Department of Behavioral Sciences. And Mr. Henry is in St. Anne, heading an agricultural school. So you now have the opportunity to ask persons direct questions. Take the opportunity, students. Yeah? ask any questions that, you know, popped up for you. Like, how many of you, just show us in the chat, do they have chat features, Mr. Carver?
Yes,
Tell us if they
have
know
access.
what are, yes. So I heard big words like remittances, yeah? And globalization and all these, you know, what are those big words? And how do they relate to migration and what we spoke about last week when we spoke about juvenile lifers who are incarcerated in the US, and we spoke about the whole psychosocial, sociocultural issues. Are you seeing the links as Dr. Brown just indicated? Are you able to connect the dots? Yeah? See where all the parts are. Feel free, ask questions. We want to hear from you. This is your forum, students.
Yes, Risa Behari spoke about the tears. I wanted to focus on the tears, blood, sweat, and tears. And the tears are picked up some by Dr. Esnard and Mr. Henry picked up on some of those issues. But last week again, we spoke about what happens to the kids who are left behind. And those videos that you were asked to look at, that little boy in Mandeville, whose father didn't speak to him or write to him. What are your experiences and how do you feel about how we as a Caribbean people should be addressing some of the tears of our workers? How do we get to that? I would like to throw that question out at this point to our students. Any of you see the tears coming through those presentations?
Hi.
Hi, Andrea.
Andrea. I was listening to Dr. Talia Epiphanim, and she mentioned COVID-19 restrictions. Okay? And she also mentioned insurance. So my question is, well, these people leave from one point to another, okay? So that they could better or send stuff for their family, something like that. If they do have any health insurance and they work with these people like the state mentioned and they are not being treated well, what are they supposed to do?
Right. Morning, Andrea, and I'm hoping that I'm capturing your question well. You're asking, given the risk that they face in the pandemic, what are the options for the workers?
Yeah, who do not have the health insurance.
Right. So you're asking, what are some of the ways in which these workers could be helped in that particular instance? No? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay. All right, I just wanted to make sure I heard the question because the internet, of course, the connectivity issue, it faded in and out while you were speaking. But most certainly, this is a question that even our advocates, we have a group of workers in Canada, we have across the region, but there are many persons who are now fighting tooth and nail for those workers to get the benefits that they deserve and to be protected financially and socially in the pandemic. So that I can't tell you that there is a right, there's an answer that we could automatically say, this is what's going to happen. But I think they're really trying to get the attention of the state, the players in this particular design and managed program to understand, listen, let's sit and pause. Let's review this program. Let's think about the workers and put their life at the center of the decisions and the structures that we put in place in really designing this and making it function. So it can't just be business as usual. And I think COVID-19 has really taught us that. And it has brought the lessons to light. And certainly those lessons cannot be just taken for granted because we learn nothing and move forward. We do not move forward as a society if we are understanding things and getting lessons and not taking what we can from those lessons.
Thank you for that response. Okay. Andrea, you were saying, go ahead.
No, I was now for her response and answer my question.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, great. right.
Mr. Henry, I'm glad you started off your presentation with, and I like the phrase because I sent it to my students, borderless economies. And I mean, well, we are social studies form 5, so I want you to expand on that for them because we did globalization and so forth, but that term borderless economies, I'm glad you mentioned it because I didn't talk about it when I did globalization with them. So I would like you to probably tell them a little more about it because it's a phrase that I know they can use for CSEC.
Right. Well, thank you. I think one of the things that has come home to us so much more today in the experience of the pandemic is certainly how the movement of people impacts upon the quality of life that we experience wherever we are in the world, even in very remote spaces. And what we're seeing is the fluidity or the looseness of borders, whether it is that we are moving as migrants or we're moving ideas or we're exchanging ideas virtually. But there was a time past in my own lifetime when the ability to transfer an idea or the person or your person from one place to the next would take a significant amount of time. Young people today may take for granted the opportunity of the speed of information and the transfer of knowledge from place to place. In the same way, what we're saying is if we understand that what we now construct or see as the construction of globalization or the process of globalization, which includes people, the movement of people, the movement of ideas, the fluidity of borders, some of which happens in such a way that it creates inequity. Sometimes there's social injustice and imbalances. There's a kind of unequal outcome depending on the wealth of nations or the placement of these nations. But the fact of the matter is that we are in a relationship, regardless of whether we acknowledge it or not, with our neighbors, whether to the north or to the south. And the decisions and choices that people make in those spaces affect our lives everywhere, anywhere, all the time. And it is also because we have developed what is the foundation or the platform of ICTs. The ability to move now based on emergent discoveries and developments in technologies. And again, I say young people today would take these things for granted. There's a time I would wait for weeks for a letter to come from England or whoever to send something, or for a phone call to happen, we go line up somewhere and wait for the phone booth. And so today it's at our fingertips. And that facility, information and technology moving like that makes globalization what it is. That being said, in that regard, we then have to look then at what is the new interpretation of what we're talking about here today with regard to food security and what it means for persons who, whether virtually or not, the fact that there are persons who are able to sit in an office and trade globally and buy wheat or corn in the US and affect prices there, it also means that they're able to affect the price of commodities in Jamaica. The value of product that goes into, or in any of the Caribbean country, the value of product that goes into being able to develop a small farm and successfully benefit from that is influenced by what is being done with regard to those characteristics, those inputs that support what food security looks like. The issues of poverty or wealth, on the other hand, the issues of health and people being able to pursue their ambitions because they're in a climate or an environment that supports good health and nutrition, of course. Those are some of the things that help us to understand what food security means and how it is that it is influencing our lives, where we are now, what you eat, when you eat, what types of food we are eating, those things are as a result too of what is happening in a global context. You see the international brands, the KFC, the Burger King, and so on. And those things in a pandemic are really now speaking to us, because people are just now talking about, am I going to eat healthy? Will I be planting anything in my backyard? Will I be developing my own small farm so that I can improve my own nutritional experience? And those things are weighed in a culture in which we have always had the fast food and so on, are weighed against our desire for that kind of an approach. And young people are the ones who are right there at the forefront of this. The advertising affects you, the global advertising, the marketing of particular kinds of products affects you, because it builds onto your sensitization of what you think is good for you or not good for you, and you respond accordingly. As Doctor said earlier, there are some persons who fall into that space in which, if the local economy was able to provide for their needs, they would not necessarily have to be participating in the movement of people to go somewhere else to try to improve their lot by working for somebody else somewhere else. But then if the middle class continues to move and to migrate, it leaves a population of persons who are constantly at that average space of always needing the support of government, and government that doesn't have the income and the support for those people will look for opportunities and say, yes, you can travel abroad on this this farming program, and then say, no, but we can't provide the security of insurance for you when you travel in this regard. So there are many interconnected things that make the idea of globalization what it is, and it has implications for what we eat, how we live, where we live, and the quality of life that we have in that space.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. And Dr. Esnard also had her hand up. You wanted to say something?
I wanted to add to that, Mr. Henry, because when we think about the borderless economy, I would take that one step further to say the borderless society, because in that global society that we are, we have that free movement of information, of culture, music, food. It's all a lot. It's not just the economy, but it's also how we live our lives on an everyday basis and how we understand that narrative to be. I know one thing more than ever, that in this pandemic, what the information that is coming across, for example, the TikTok as a social media platform has taken over the space and the information that comes through, particularly for young persons and even older ones as well, who are part of this particular wave. But one thing I remember distinctly, and this is something that I would like to share, speaking to a farmer recently in Jamaica and asking about her experiences, and she's talking as a woman who's in agriculture, and she's making the point that, there's still so many stereotypes and hiccups around agriculture and food production in the Caribbean that we have not unpacked as yet. We haven't unpacked that. We still think of agriculture as a man thing. And I'm saying this now, a Caribbean vocabulary, a man thing. This is what men do, right? We're still thinking about agriculture as something that doesn't have the level of class that we place the hierarchy on in terms of job and the labor force. So agriculture is down there. So that hierarchy of labor and job and skills, we don't really also address that. And what she has said to me is that agriculture, one, has not been given the attention that it should be given in our Caribbean space. And I want us to situate that back to our history and understand that in my own teaching for development studies, I talk to my students about the Muscovado bias. That is the thinking that everything foreign, as we say, is better. So that if you want food, you import it. If you want clothes, you import it. You want a nice week, everything you want has to be imported, because what is local has no value or doesn't have the comparative value as what comes from abroad. That is something that we do not really take to task in the way that we should to sustain our Caribbean societies. And therefore, when we have workers who are leaving their own home and their families to go and invest in farm work that they could do in their own home countries, that tells a deeper story that our governments need to contend with, right? That's one. But the other one is, in the pandemic, this young lady said to me, she has to thank the pandemic. And I asked why. She said, because for the first time, people are coming to her and asking her, what do you produce? How do you produce it? Is it organic? I want to buy it. So agriculture is now getting, local production is now getting a boost because borders physically are closed. So that importation of food that we have grown accustomed to is curtailed by the physical closure of our borders. You know what that means? It means that we now have to fall back on what we could do as a people on our own farms, growing in our backyard, and we learn to be more resilient and to appreciate what we could do as a people around food security to sustain ourselves. That is a lesson I think all of us have to take and move forward with.
All right. So thanks for that again, Dr. Esnard. And as a director of an agriculture school, I would also encourage the young people here to not just go in the backyard, but also get the formal training on how to use pesticides, if using it at all, and other things to make sure that the food security is a safe kind of security. I would like to hear also from the young people, any other questions? And if not, Mrs. Moraldo Bowen, feel free to read for us. I know they may be texting you off. Feel free to read off your text if they give you permission to, if they're a bit shy. Or Miss Bihari, feel free to share what they are sharing with you. Andrea, you have a question or comment? Go ahead. Great.
Hi, you was talking about gardening and farms and pesticides. So I have started my own garden in my backyard, and there are these little white insects under the plant. I do not know how to get rid of them. What can I use for it?
All right, so great, Andrea. So the good thing with a forum like this is that we have created a network. So I will be happy to put you on to one of our teachers after this session who can give you some advice. So good outcome of the seminar so far, Dr. Brown. You see, we're making connections. So great.
Just to
Yes.
add quickly, I think she's referring to what is commonly called white
The white
flies.
fly. Yeah, the white
Right.
fly.
So
But
in
we
your,
can put on to one of the teachers to give her a good understanding of what to do. I think we can give her a crash course now on that.
oh, but it's
Yeah.
a simple fix, you know. It's
Mr. Henry.
yes, if it's in her little garden, if she does a small mixture of soap and water, and if she gets one of those little spray containers, it works very well, and that would add some value to what she wants to do there. It would get rid of them.
Can I just make a very quick point here to link Dr. Esnard's point to Mr. Sidney's issue of the borderless economies? I think this discussion brings us to the issue of what is the charge that we are going to get pushed towards our students of the next generation. How do we find solutions, and how do we deal with the issue of the technology that we've now been forced to become familiar with through COVID? And I think this harks back to our session last week and the sessions we had at our international conference on migration, where we spoke about the role of the tertiary institution. And I think that young man last week mentioned it, the role of the tertiary institution in how do we as a tertiary institution and high school students link ourselves to the solution of the farm workers and the migration issues that come out of it. And I think the notion of looking at the tiers, looking at the use of the technology for counseling, we've spoken about this before, the use of the technology for telecounseling to support those workers who are doing that under that kind of pressure that Dr. Esnard speaks about, must be one of the ways that we must address this. This will mean that we could have volunteers at the sixth form level who could be trained across the Caribbean, because just having this discussion is just making me so excited about tapping into the energy of the youth of the Caribbean.
Exactly.
To solve our problems, as Dr. Esnard is saying. We have to solve our problems not just at the macro policy level and at the community level through, sharing our agricultural practices to deal with whitefly or whatever.
We can definitely do that, Andrea.
Yes, it's an ideal forum.
Link it to resources, but we must also do this to deal with the micro level issues that the pressure that those farm workers are going through should not be addressed just by the advocates in Canada, but could we possibly have a network of persons linked to the Migration Studies Unit at UWI Mona,
Yes.
who could be trained by Zoom to address telecounseling needs of the children left behind, who are the same children who the mother is gone to get money for to get her education at UWI. That child, as Andrea pointed out last week, is a child who knows. I think Mrs. Moraldo had mentioned intention. I remember now. The intention of the mother is to go abroad to help her at school. But the reality on the ground is that that child is experiencing psychosocial problems. And the child in that video we spoke about from Mandeville, who's missing his father. Can we not provide solutions in the Caribbean where their own people with their own accent, with their own understanding of their sociocultural context, provide support services for those farm workers? Can we not provide orientation services, which could be, what do you call it now, outsourced to a UWI program so that the orientation takes place in the Caribbean before they go? These are suggestions and recommendations that came out of a webinar Dr. Esnard and I did from last year. And then we had a follow-up conference in November. Can we not just have these webinars in this way, but have them in a fashion where we can start pulling together some of these in a very practical, hands-on way in terms of solutions? And we're hoping through this series of webinars to put it on, as you know, on YouTube channels so that you can look at it and you can look at them again. And when you're studying, you can go back to some of these webinars and come up with the way forward in terms of challenges and policies. So I want to end there to put this as a charge to you young people as you think about your future and your careers and where you're going to go after sixth form, to do something concrete about these issues embedded in this notion of the borderless economies and borderless societies.
Yes, and a lot of implications as well for technology, ICTs, as you all heard, in terms of that borderlessness and working remotely and so on. And that's up your alley, young people. You know, you love the agriculture, the whole idea of the technology, drones in agriculture. Maybe that's the answer to picking strawberries remotely and so on. Okay, so Ms. Bihari, you had a question or a comment. We'll take the last one from you and then we close off. We hand over to Mr. Kava and we close off because we're way over our time. Go ahead, Ms. Bihari.
One of the things that I wanted to mention, because as a geography teacher, I try to link it to the topics that my students are learning. One of the things that I wanted to mention is a kind of a conglomeration of the points made by Ms. Crawford Brown, Dr. Esnard, and Mr. Henry. How much do governments impact the policies of transnational corporations? Because a lot of these farms are transnational corporations. So as the government where the farm is based, how much impact do they have on the policies that those farms make? And even if there are governmental policies, what monitoring programs do they have to ensure that those policies are followed by those farms? Furthermore, as the source of the migrants, what impact do our governments have on those same companies saying that you're hiring our employees? There are push factors that are pushing our employees, our migrants, to go to your farms. But what guarantee do you have? What guarantee do we have, do you give us, that they're going to come back wholesome, healthy, as you said, and emotionally stable? But more so, what skill do they get from it? Why are they not using these farming techniques to educate? I mean, yes, there brings the question, what do the farms get from educating our employees who would then take that knowledge and information and not return? But if you're just treating them as disposable, then I'm sorry to say, but there is no reason for you not to educate them further. There is nothing wrong with having a more educated, more skilled workforce. So you're bringing into the question of push and pull factors, of reverting that brain drain to make sense so that you send workers back. Yes, you're taking the less educated, more vulnerable workers, but you're empowering them through their employment. And more importantly, the effects of transnational corporations and the fact that they are the definition of a borderless economy. Yeah. So thank you so much for including me, Ms. Williams, Dr. Williams.
Yes, okay, thank you. And again, we challenge the young people to take these messages, these important lessons, and we have the final session of this seminar, the series of seminars for them to come up with solutions through their own presentations. So Ms. Behari and Mrs. Moraldo and the other teachers here, it's your task to incorporate this into your geography, your history, and so that we can hear from them as they present, just like myself, Mr. Henry, Dr. Crawford Brown, Dr. Esnard, Mr. Broom, and all the other presenters so far, they will do the same. So young people like Jaheem, Andrea, we look forward to hearing from you as you take all of this information. Okay, Ayana and Donovan, yeah, Maya, we want to hear from you as you present at the last of this seminar. So thanks again, and over to you, Mr. Carver. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. There is so much to unpack here, and I'm not even going to try to summarize. We don't have time. We're way over time, but it's been an incredibly positive session. I look forward to seeing you all again next Tuesday, March 16th, again at 9 o'clock, when Dr. Crawford Brown will discuss the societal and generational impacts caused by one or both parents working abroad. So to follow up on all that's been talked about here with the migration bits, I think this is an essential piece of the conversation. And again, thank you all, especially Dr. Esnard and Mr. Henry, for being with us this morning and presenting, and for you, Dr. Williams, for moderating the conversation. Have a wonderful day, all. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.